So, this talk has 217 slides. I'm going to try to stay on pace. I'm going to pay Greg, who's over there, $1 for every slide that I have to skip. So let's get started. My name is Nolen, and I wasn't really sure how to introduce myself, so I looked up some information on the World Wide Web, which I'm going to share with you. I make games that look something like this, so totally normal stuff there, and I make useful computer programs that people use to solve real-world problems that look like this. Also really useful. I totally forgot this till last night, but I actually have a patent, which, believe it or not, is going to come up later in the talk. And for some period of time, people paid me to write software according to this video. But more importantly than all of that, I like to connect strangers on the internet, and that's what we're going to talk about today. So a lot of this talk is going to be about a website called 1 Million Checkboxes. And so I kind of want to ask, although it's dark and I won't be able to tell, who here is familiar with 1 Million Checkboxes? Maybe you used it. Maybe you've read about it. OK, so I don't know what the appropriate response is, but I'm assuming that that is a decent amount of you. I'm still going to recap it really briefly. 1 Million Checkboxes was a website that had 1 million checkboxes on it, which you probably could have guessed. But the bit was that they were global. Checking or unchecking a box, checked or unchecked it for everybody in the world immediately. Now, I built this site in about 2 days, and I really did not expect it to be very popular, but I was very, very wrong. Within hours, there were tens of thousands of people on the site checking millions of boxes, and that was while it was constantly crashing because it couldn't handle the load. Things escalated quickly. There were 500,000 players in the first 2 days after launch, 650 million boxes checked in the 2 weeks that I kept the site online. I barely slept, and it got a bunch of media attention. It was nuts. I did interviews with the Washington Post and the New York Times. There's a Wikipedia page. There's like a Know Your Meme page. I sent a statement to People magazine. It was great. It was fun, and I learned a lot, and I want to tell you about it. So I'm going to tell you a couple of different things. We're going to talk about technology. How did I build 1 million checkboxes, and how did I scale it up to handle the load? Then we're going to talk about game design. I'm going to offer you some theories that are probably wrong about why it was popular. And then I'm going to talk about something that I'm more confident about, how to get strangers to interact in a kind way on the internet. And then finally, I'm going to come back and I'm going to tell you a story from 1 Million Checkboxes that is really special to me. So let's talk about building it. One thing I want to say up front is that depending on your background, you're not going to recognize all of the terms that I'm going to throw at you. And that is totally OK. I promise that anything that I used here is something that I could summarize to you in about 5 minutes. And really, the skill that I brought to the table was being able to glue those things together more than anything. And I promise that you can do that too. That aside, 1 Million Checkboxes started as a conversation with my friend Neil, who makes the website neil.fun. It's a really great website. We were pitching different ideas to potentially work on, and I threw out 1 million checkboxes, and we thought it was kind of funny, but really dumb and not worth pursuing. But I had been working on this other game, this face-controlled Pac-Man game, for like a month, and it had taken like forever to get this thing out. I was really frustrated, and I was like, Neil, I'm going to make this dumb website in like 2 days just to have shipped something. And so over that weekend, I started trying to figure out how to do the front-end work. I have a lot of practice making servers, not a lot of practice making websites, so this was the big blocker for me. The first thing that I needed to solve was, how do you put 1 million of something on a website at all? And I tried the dumb thing first. I made a file, and it was 1 million lines long. This is real. It's on this computer. And it was 1 million 4 lines long. There's HTML opening and closing tags, and there's 1 million checkboxes. And it does technically open eventually on this computer, which is beefy. But it doesn't work super well. So we need to do something better. What we want to do is instead only render the stuff that users can see. Right? The reason that rendering 1 million things is expensive is because it's 1 million things, not because you need a really tall web page to do it. So you make a web page that is that tall, and you keep track of the scroll position, and then you just render the checkboxes around where the user is. This is a relatively common problem, maybe not for something this dumb, but there's a library called React Window that I used that just kind of solves this out of the box for you. Right, so this is kind of a visual for that. I can't show you the checkboxes that you can't see because that's not how it works, but I've drawn them down there. React Window, you simply tell, hey, I want a grid, and the grid's this big, the elements in the grid are this big, I have this many elements, figure it out, and it does. It's great. It's very simple to use. So the next problem I ran into was managing state. I'm going to say this a lot, but 1 million's a big number, and we needed to store state for all 1 million checkboxes. How do we do that? We need to store that state, but we don't really need to know that much. We need to ask, we need to be able to ask, is this box checked? And we need to be able to change whether a box is checked. And we need to be able to download the state, and that's literally it. So I think one important observation here is that checkboxes are like bits, right? Like a checkbox is checked or unchecked, a bit is 0 or 1. And we can use that here. We can use something called a bit set, which is just an easy way to store and query the state of a bunch of bits. Some of you might not know what that is, but know what I mean by array of unsigned 8-bit ints. That is fundamentally what it is. That is, you take 1,000,000 bits and you slice them up into bytes, 8 bits in a byte, so that's 125,000 bytes. And you stuff all those into an array. Querying that array is simple. If you want bit 11, you look up the second byte, you look at the third bit inside it, and changing it is just like a little bit of bit twiddling that, if you're comfortable with bit twiddling, is also quite simple. The third problem here was talking to the server, right? Like we need to, I don't know, interface with it in some way. And we're not going to go over all of this code, but there wasn't that much code here. Conceptually, what I did was pretty simple. We ask the server on page load which boxes have been checked. We download that full bit set, all 125 kilobytes. We use WebSockets to listen for when a box changes. The server pushes events to us. And occasionally, the server sends us a full state snapshot as well, the state of all 1,000,000 checkboxes. And that's just to kind of keep things in sync. If, for example, your tab was backgrounded when you got some updates, those might not have gone through. And so that's a technique that I've used in a lot of applications like that. Finally, if a user checks a box, we ignore any updates to that box for a small period of time, just because their state is probably more current than whatever the server is telling them. And that's it. That is all of the front-end code, and it barely changed. I think I did fix a bug in prod at some point. I changed the protocol. I added a donation link. And I think that's literally it until I sunset the site. So very little changed there. How about the back end? Well, at a high level, the architecture looked something like this. That is, we've got a client, it's got the bit set, it's got the UI, we've got a server, it sends some static content like our HTML, it tells our client when boxes are checked, and that is about it. But we can dive in a little bit there. The server is comprised of a couple of parts. We had Nginx acting as a reverse proxy and serving up static content. It was acting as a reverse proxy for some Flask servers. Those were in charge of the checkbox state, sending that on page load, and also the WebSocket connections that we had. And those Flask servers interfaced with Redis, which stored all of our 1,000,000 bits and had a pub sub as well. That was a couple of terms, so I'm going to define them really quickly. Nginx is a fast web server, really good at doing a bunch of stuff, serving up content, and also acting as a reverse proxy, which is a way, it's like a weirdly confusing name for you talk to a thing and that thing connects you to lots of things. All the clients connect to Nginx, Nginx forwards you on to many things sitting behind it. The things sitting behind it were Flask, an easy way to make a kind of slow server in Python. A pub sub is a way for a program to publish stuff that other programs subscribe to. And Redis is a really fast, easy to use database that also supports pub subs. So what did Redis do here? Well, first off, you can literally tell Redis, hey, hold on to these 1,000,000 bits for me and let me change them, which is exactly what we needed. But it also has pub sub support, which we needed. It was very handy. And we need that because I wanted to have multiple Flask servers to start. And I did that not because I thought I needed to. I didn't really expect this to get much activity. But by choosing to have 2 servers to start, it forced me to pick an architecture that was conceivably scalable. Right? If I'd only used one, I hadn't really demonstrated that I could have more than one server. And then given that, if I'm connected to one of those servers and you're connected to another, and you check a box, well, my Flask server needs to hear about that to tell me. Right? That looks something like this. One client talks to a server. That server tells Redis, hey, this box was checked. Other server reads from that pub sub on Redis and tells me that box 2 was checked. So kind of once again, that's the whole backend architecture. And it changed in some meaningful ways. I made it substantially faster. But all of those boxes remained. Some of the labels changed. The protocol changed. But that is fundamentally how things worked the whole time. So before I tell you about scaling the site, I want to tell you kind of what was going through my head as I scaled it. A few things in mind. The biggest one was to not have any unbounded costs. It was really important to me to be able to calculate exactly how much money I would owe people for running this website for one more day. And that's just that you hear a lot about websites that go viral and the owner has a $10,000 bill. I wasn't OK with having something like that. Second was to embrace the short term. I kind of assumed that people wouldn't be interested in the site for that long, and so I took on tons of technical debt. I came up with solutions that I could deploy in like 2 hours instead of a day because I figured that was the right trade-off. And I think it basically was. I tried to keep things simple and self-hosted. This is mostly a preference of my own. I like to be able to log into computers and like look at them, which serverless stuff doesn't really let me do. Tried to have fun, right? At some points, this was stressful, and I tried to remember this was a fun thing to do. At some point, I thought that I had dropped my whole database, and I got really stressed out because like that's a really bad thing to do in prod as a software engineer. But then I realized that in this case, I could just like post like, hey guys, drop the database. You're gonna have to check all the boxes again, figure it out. And like that's okay, right? Like that would have been, if anything, I should have dropped the database. It was fine. I hadn't dropped it. And then finally, it was really important to me to keep the site global. I think a lot of the magic was jumping anywhere and immediately seeing updates no matter what. A really clear optimization would have been to only send you updates for the checkboxes that you could see, just like rendering. But I think that would have lost a lot of the magic if you had to load pages as you scrolled elsewhere. So while this was the most common suggestion people gave me, it was something that I just wasn't OK with doing. There are those principles for you, just in case you want to see them all on one slide, but let's keep going. So within about 30 minutes, activity on the site looked like this. And this was already well past what I expected. 55,000 boxes have been checked. Things are popping off. This is cool. This is exciting. And pretty clearly, my server wasn't going to be able to maintain this load. There was like activity on my tweet. I was going up on Hacker News, whatever. So I figured we'll add more servers, right? This is why we picked an architecture that could scale. And I added another server, and this is what happened. Just immediately maxed out all of the cores on it. So obviously, you just keep adding servers. And I had no automation for spinning up the servers, which you can really see in my naming conventions. We got up to mil 8 by the end. But I just kept doing this. And then at some point was like, you know what, all right, I can't buy my way out of this problem. I need to do something smarter. So, sorry, side note, I was doing this during a show at ITP, which is just down the street. I was supposed to be showing my Pac-Man game, and so I was trying to like maintain eye contact with strangers while like spinning up servers in the background, which was very silly. But at some point I was like, all right, we need to do something smarter. We're gonna batch our updates. And the idea there is that originally, anytime any of you checked anything, I immediately told everyone. But there are a bunch of fixed costs to sending a message. And those costs are there whether you're sending a message about 1 box or 200. So why don't we instead send messages about like 200 boxes? And I made sure that those messages went out every 0.1 seconds, no matter what, so that there wasn't like a long delay. But this helped with performance a ton. 200 was great. 400 was even better. I think I ended up at 600 or 800. Batching is really, really useful. So at about 1 a.m., I had rolled all that out, and I decided that it was time to go to bed. And then Greg, the person that I might owe some money, texted me. And this text is unreadable. But what he's trying to say is that he's proud of me and that he's really worried about my bandwidth costs. And love you, Greg. So I freaked out when I got this message because I really just hadn't considered this when I rolled out the site. It's not a traditionally heavy user of bandwidth. It's a dumb site with checkboxes on it. So I hadn't done any math here, and I started doing math, and it seemed kind of scary. Like, we send clients 125 kilobytes on page load. We send them 125 kilobytes every 30 seconds. If we have 1,000 clients, that's 2 gigs a minute. We've got more than 1,000 clients. I'm not counting the updates that I'm sending out. Like, I don't know, not good. And at some point, I like didn't divide by 100 somewhere, and I thought that I like already owed $10,000, and it took me like 2 days to shake that. But I texted with Greg, and Greg convinced me that I made a mistake. I ran this command ip-s link show dev eth0 to confirm that. And then I started, regardless, rolling out some changes to try to reduce my bandwidth consumption. A lot of those changes were surprisingly easy. For example, to reduce the frequency of state snapshots, I halved my bandwidth usage by changing a number from 30 to 60. And to improve my batching, I had done this really kind of dumb thing where I was sending these big JSON objects telling you which boxes had been checked. I instead just sent these arrays where the first array was implicitly these boxes are checked. The second one was these boxes aren't. This is literally 10 times shorter. You can't tell because the font is a little bigger. And so that saved a lot of bandwidth. The third thing I did is a little more complicated. I used this famously confusing TC thing called TC, which stands for traffic control, that lets you limit the amount of bandwidth that a box emits. This is a set of rules that cap the amount of bandwidth my box will send to 250 megabits. And this one is confusing. This is actually what I have a patent in, which is pretty funny, which I don't think is a good thing. I think software patents are bad, but that's the culture at AWS, and we're going to move on. So I put those rules into place, and I posted about how I was trying to avoid big bills. I had broken clients while shipping this out, and so I was apologizing for that. And immediately after I posted that, someone clearly tried to give me a big bill. The timing here is super suspicious. But there, the blue line is the amount of traffic my box was trying to send, and you can see that it's capped at the purple line, the amount of bytes that actually left, which is exactly where we put that rate limit in place. And so I was happy to have that there. TC is very cool. The next day, I woke up, and things had mostly escalated, except that there was this gap. And the reason for this gap was that, really embarrassingly, I hadn't validated the data that people were sending me, and someone checked box 1 billion, which broke everything. So I fixed that. And then I started looking into slightly more real problems. The big thing was that initial page load was really, really slow. And that was because Redis was getting hammered. We had a single Redis instance that we were doing all these writes to, tens of thousands of writes, right? People checking boxes. But we also had to query it whenever you loaded the page to tell you what boxes were checked. And so the solution to that was to just spin up a Redis replica and send all of our reads to that replica instead of overloading the thing that we were writing to. But I ran into this really funny problem. I was using DigitalOcean's managed Redis thing, and I wanted to get the private IP of my Redis instance. I was a little worried that if I talked to it over the public IP, some of my traffic might traverse the public internet, which would give me a bigger bandwidth bill. And I just couldn't find the private IP anywhere on the website. And I was working fast, so instead of filing a ticket, I just port scanned my entire network and connected to everything with my Redis Connect credentials. And eventually I found it. I found it on the 5th try. And then I hard-coded that IP, and it never changed, and it was great. All right, so what else went wrong? My servers were randomly crashing, and I still can't quite tell you why this is. It was something about running a preforked web server, and I had a Redis connection pool, and Python doesn't like threads, and I don't know. My servers failed to get Redis connections, and they crashed, and I was way too tired to debug this. So I wrote this script that just bounced all my servers all the time, and that fixed it, and I moved on. Final problem I ran into on day 2 was stale updates. And this is kind of a pernicious problem in systems like this. I felt a little silly having written it because I've made a lot of systems like this. But the way updates worked is that clients get updates when boxes are checked and unchecked, and they get full state snapshots too. And you have a problem if those arrive in the wrong order, right? If you get a full state snapshot and it's up to date, and then you get a bunch of old updates about checkboxes that were checked, 20 minutes ago, you still apply those updates, and then you get another full state snapshot, and 50,000 things change at once, and it looks really glitchy and bad. Fortunately, this is an easy fix. You just add timestamps to everything or any other monotonically increasing integer. And if you get a batch of updates that has a timestamp that is earlier than the timestamp of your latest full state snapshot, you just ignore them. So that approximately stabilized the site. It was still a little slow at times, but it stayed up overnight on the second night and mostly was working okay. So I relaxed for a bit. This was about the time that I started getting requests to do interviews. And I'm not going to talk about that much, but I do really need to tell you one thing, which is I did this interview with the Washington Post, and in the question they asked me about croquet, and so I made a joke about croquet. I was like, yeah, the problem with croquet is that you can't hit the ball of anyone in the world, and my website fixes that because you can uncheck boxes. And then in the printed interview, they removed the context about croquet. So I just looked like I was the type of guy that brings up croquet all the time. Which I swear I'm not. I haven't played croquet in 20 years. This is very important to me. I think this is so funny. I just want to be clear. I'm not mad about this, but it is funny. So then I started thinking about how to sunset the site. I figured that it was about time to wrap things up. People wouldn't stay interested in it forever. I wanted to provide a real ending instead of just kind of letting it die off. And I figured that might drive more activity to the site. And so I wanted to make it faster. I reached out to my friend Elliot, who's a very talented performance engineer that I used to work with, and asked him if he was down to help me rewrite the site, and he was. And over 12 hours on a Sunday, we rewrote everything in Go. And things were slightly faster. This is not a fully fair comparison because we thought more about performance with Go. I had written shitty Python, but this was pretty free with Go, and I would have had to use my brain with Python, so I don't know. And then I implemented my sunsetting plan, which was to make boxes freeze if they had been checked for too long. And that way, eventually, all the boxes would be frozen, and the site would be frozen as fully checked. That mostly just meant adding a little more state to Redis. I taught Redis to track the time that a box was last checked, and then check that when trying to uncheck a box and not let people. And then I added another bit set that represented boxes that had been frozen. Now, updating all of this state in a race condition-free way might seem really challenging to you, but a really cool thing about Redis is that you can write Lua scripts that run atomically. And so I just wrote all of my logic in Lua without thinking about race conditions at all, and then I uploaded a Lua script to Redis, and everything worked out of the box. Redis is great. So what did I learn from this? I think a couple of things. Redis and Nginx are great. They are amazing pieces of software. And I think shipping a prototype is too. I wouldn't have known what to optimize if I had tried to make all these optimizations in advance. But I know I was also much more motivated with trying to keep the site online. But I was glad that I designed so that I could conceivably scale this. I'm really glad that I didn't use a service that kind of auto-scales, but that you pay for that scaling for. I do think that convex and durable objects are both very cool pieces of technology. But when I look at their pricing pages, I really struggle to understand how much I would have spent on 1 million checkboxes, and that just would have been too uncomfortable for me. I logged everything, all 650 million events. I actually logged those to Redis too, and I'm glad I did. And I'm really happy that I ended the site the way that I did. I think that providing an ending to something like this is worthwhile. So I don't really understand why the site was so popular, but I can offer you a couple of things that I think I did that were interesting. To start, let's play a game. I want everyone here to try to read my mind. And the thing we're going to do is that I'm going to show you 4 squares, and I want everyone to pick the same one that I'm going to pick. So that seems pretty silly, right? Obviously you pick the red square. It's not even a question. But the study of this, sorry, don't lie, who picked the red square, whatever. This doesn't count for skipping slides. These are called Schelling points, or focal points, which is a less fun name, which is roughly the study of how people make decisions when they want to make the same decision as somebody else, but they can't communicate. And I think they're really, really interesting when you get into kind of the broader literature here. It's something I think a lot about with these stranger interaction games. Now, here's something from 1 million checkboxes. It is a very direct application of Schelling points, right? We have some boxes that are colored. And I gave people something to focus on. Did it work? Did people click these boxes more? Well, yes, absolutely. Outside of box 0, all of the top clicked boxes are colored ones. They're before the other ones in the top row. And I think that was fun. It gave people something to focus on. But I didn't explain it. There was no explanation on the website. And so this was one of the most common questions that I got. Right? People wanted to know what the colored checkboxes were, and lots of people came up with theories, like those are the boxes that people are clicking the most, which was true, but not for the reason that you think it's true. And I think that helped too. It's just kind of fun to have a little mystery that people can form theories about. It's nice to have numbers. People like it when numbers go up, and there were a few numbers on the site. There was the number of boxes that were checked, but there was also your own high score, the number of boxes that you had checked or unchecked, and that split out the colored boxes separately. And when people communicated with me about the site, a lot of the time they would send me this screenshot. Tommy here checked 18,000 boxes, which is insane. And so I think that people got a lot out of that. That was just stored in local storage. There was nothing fancy there. One thing that I think mattered a whole lot was how anonymous this is. And this is going to be a big kind of theme of the broader talk here. Because you knew so little about the other people, people could come up with their own narratives. And some of these were just checkers versus uncheckers or other things like that. But I heard a lot of things that were yeah, I was following this guy around and they were checking boxes and I was unchecking boxes right behind him and they were getting so mad. And you don't know that, right? And if you could see them, you would be able to tell that they're not paying any attention to you. But since you can't, since this is all of the interaction that you get really attached to your stories. Having more information is not always better. One last thing that's hard for me to talk about is that I heard a lot of people say this reminded them of the old internet. And I didn't make this with that in mind, but I grew up on the old internet, so I'm sure that has influenced my tastes. My understanding of this is that the site wasn't monetized in ways that people are kind of sick of. And that was kind of an intentional choice, but not a particularly artistic one. I just didn't really want to put ads on it. But it is something that I've been thinking about with future work. Finally, I think a thing that helped a lot was that it had a good name. And by a good name, I mean that it both described exactly what it was and didn't make any sense at all. I recently made a website called everyuuid.com, and I tried to channel the same thing. It both describes exactly what it does and what do you mean that doesn't make any sense? So that's some stuff about OMCB. We're going to come back to it at the end. But I want to tell you about a few other things. And most of those things have to do with preventing people from being jerks on the internet. Now, I think most people in this room have used the internet, and you understand that people are jerks online. Both in just kind of like, I don't know, they write text comments that are a little mean, and also in that they like post very, very gross things. And if you just let people do whatever they want, they do gross stuff. So moderating that is a big challenge, right? Validating that every single input you're getting is okay, that's just not something that I'm able to do at the scale of some of these projects as one person. And so the philosophy that I have is that instead of trying to moderate things, you add really strict constraints that, I don't know, kind of like pull in your input enough that for the most part, what people can do is pleasant. So that's one, good because of moderation, but it also produces these really fun moments as people interact with, push against, and play with those constraints. My first attempt at this I made at Recurse Center, and it wasn't very good. It was this website or game called Infinite Hamlet that ran via Twitch chat. And it was like a joke about the infinite monkey theorem where all you could do was type the characters of Hamlet one character at a time, and they would appear on the screen. But the idea there was that if you typed a wrong character, it wouldn't appear. You'd get like a question mark instead and have to backspace it. This wasn't like popular for I think a couple of reasons. Probably fundamentally it's just not that compelling of an idea, but it's also the type of thing where it's maybe only interesting if other people are on it. I think that's something that comes up a lot here, is that a site is interesting if people are using it, but for people to use it, it has to be interesting. There's kind of a circular dependency there. That said, while it wasn't much of a success, it was, I don't know, philosophically consistent with other projects that I did, and I'm going to show you some of those. The next thing I made was a website called Stranger Video. Stranger Video showed you live video of a stranger's face until one of you blinked. You went to the website and enabled your webcam, and you saw your face cropped in real time so that you couldn't see the background. You close your eyes, open them up, and you see a stranger's face instead staring back at you. And they remain until one of you blinks. Jeroen's going to make a funny face. Jeroen's a recursor. So that's it. That is the whole experience. It is just faces. You can't show anything else. There's no text chat. There's no audio. There are no rematches. And I made this for kind of two different reasons. One is that I was thinking about the phenomenon of walking down a long hallway and seeing someone that you kind of know at the other end and wondering when you should make eye contact or otherwise acknowledge their presence. Unlike everyone here, I'm like pretty awkward and I get very in my head about things like that. At the same time, I wanted to like make Omegle, but something that I would actually use. And I kind of tried to combine both of those things, the anxiety and the safety. And that gave me a bunch of design goals. On the one hand, I wanted the experience to be safe. No communication so that you can't say something gross, only faces so that you can't show something gross, immediately hide stuff if you close your eyes. But at the same time to feel unnerving. No communication so you're super focused on a stranger's face. And there's this pulsing video tightly cropped to it, and you can barely control when the experience ends. So this got more play, about 500,000 plays during launch month. People played about 20 times if they played once. Early on, people came from Hacker News, and then OpenAI fired Sam Altman. But it was then picked up by a Japanese gaming site, and the vast majority of players came from Japan. And it's interesting to talk about what people did. I'm going to roll a video that's popular on Japanese Twitter really briefly. That's the chime in. So he made me a deranged thank you video that I can show you after if you're curious. But the behavior that I saw was really consistent. People smiled in surprise, because it's surprising to see a stranger. And then they would stare and then start to imitate each other. And that was kind of the limit of the interactivity that this medium provided, right? It was a way to demonstrate that you weren't a bot. But people also tried to make the other person laugh, as he did. And that was partially in Japan, I think, imitating a popular children's game there. But it was also like a way to win. Right? You make them laugh, they close their eyes, the connection cuts, you are a winner. So that's cool emergent gameplay, and a point I want to make is that it really only makes sense in the context of these restrictions. If this was just a general live video chat app, yeah, someone would probably try to do something funny, but I really doubt it would have been the dominant gameplay element there. And I think that's really interesting. And again, constraints don't necessarily, I don't know, like restrict gameplay. Sometimes they let you do new things. But I also heard some cool stuff. A friend of mine told me that he had never had so many strangers smile at him in his life, and I thought that was really special. That was very moving. And that's kind of what put me on this journey of continuing to make games like this. So I tried to come up with some lessons, because I wanted to do it again. One was that connection is exciting. There was like an appetite for this thing. I had no audience before making this thing, and yet a bunch of people played it. Another was that constraints here worked pretty well. I'm sure that someone smuggled something gross onto the site, but I think by and large, the experiences that people had were pretty good, especially relative to a platform like Omegle or Chat Roulette. A third was that subverting those constraints produced interesting stories. We talked about laughter, but there was other stuff. Here's Peter with paper taped over his glasses, which once again doesn't make sense if there's not an eye-related constraint here, right? And maybe this is cheating, but I also think it's like a funny story. So here's a question. How many people are jerks on the internet? I don't really fully know, but I do have some data for you that I want to show you. I made this game called Talk, Paper, Scissors, again with Greg Technology, who keeps coming up. And it was a game that was rock, paper, scissors over the phone. You called a phone number, and you recorded yourself saying rock, paper, scissors. You used voice detection to validate what you said, and then it played, assuming that you said one of those words, played your audio to them, played their audio to you, it told you who won, it was best of 3, it was kind of fun. And those constraints were super, super strict, right? This, I think, worked very, very well. I don't think that we played anything rude to anybody. It had some emergent gameplay. People competed to say like scissors in the funniest way, and that was like kind of neat. But that's not why I'm talking about it. I'm talking about it because we kept transcripts of every single call. We didn't keep the raw audio, but we did have to transcribe it, right? And we kept all of those in a database. And we can look at that. And what we found is that about 75% of the calls were people saying rock, paper, or scissors, and 25% were people saying something else. But we can dive into that. And what I found was that 1.5% of those calls were hate speech, and 1.1% were people just swearing into the phone, and 1.2% were people spamming in some way. And I think that gives us a really useful number. About 4% of our players were trying to be assholes. And that's, on the one hand, 96% weren't. On the other hand, that's 1 in 25, right? Without these constraints, you're going to ruin someone's day, and that's just not super fun. So we need them. All right, so let's go back to 1 million checkboxes. 1 million checkboxes was it? No, sorry, you already know this. Moving on. What was the constraint? What was I worried about? Well, I was really worried about drawing. I understand, and I suspect most of you do as well, what happens if you just give the internet a public canvas. There are a few images that consistently show up. And I wasn't super excited about that. And so what I did was made it difficult to draw. And the way I did that was by making the number of checkboxes in a row scale to the size of your browser. So here, I've written the word example, but it only shows up if I stretch this window to be like exactly my monitor width. And what that meant was that if you wrote something shitty on your phone, it wouldn't show up for me at all on my laptop. It would just kind of look like random checkboxes. So you could write rude things, and if you had a popular iPhone, maybe like other people with the same dimensions would see it. But you were really, really restricted by default. People noticed this. I got a lot of comments about this. Like the first comment on Hacker News was somebody complaining about this. Or not complaining, but gently suggesting that I might do something else. I got lots of comments where people drew pictures and they were like, oh my God, nobody can see my picture. This is so embarrassing. But I think it worked really well. I'm happy with this constraint. So did this produce any interesting gameplay? Well, I really do think that it did. So I'm going to tell you about that. But before I do, I need to remind you about how I stored state on this website. The way that it worked was that we had checkboxes, and they were like bits, right? We had 1 million bits. We had 1 million checkboxes. Each bit corresponded to a checkbox. This is important soon. A couple of days in, I dumped my database. I don't really know why I did this. When someone checked box number 1 billion, I had made a script to dump my database, and so it was like already in my path and already in my muscle memory, and I think I just kind of ran it without thinking because I was exhausted. But I fully expected to see complete nonsense, right? Like, there's no reason that I should see anything interesting. Instead, what I saw looked like this. What the fuck is that? I panicked. I absolutely panicked. I assumed that I had been hacked. I assumed that either somebody had logged in to my machine, which was very bad, or that I wasn't validating data in some other way, and someone was writing raw strings to my database, which was probably less bad, but still really bad. I was having these nightmares that I was having to post about how, like, hey, sorry, the website got hacked. This is really bad. Sorry. But as I searched through my logs and through my code, I couldn't find anything. We were validating data correctly. There was no evidence of intrusion. Nothing was wrong. And then, in that moment of panic, at some point, I saw it. I looked at where those bytes should be on the website. That is, that H there, right? That represents a byte, which is 8 bits, which is 8 checkboxes, and specifically, it's those 8 checkboxes. There was a pattern to those checkboxes. And if I change something in that pattern, it immediately reappeared, as you can see here. Maybe you can see the pattern. It's a little hard to see. I hadn't been hacked. Somebody was writing me a message in binary. Now, the way this works is a little complicated depending on your background, but we've got some checkboxes, right? And those checkboxes, well, we've got 0s and 1s for those checkboxes, and we can group them up into groups of 8. That gives us a byte, and that byte represents a number between 0 and 255. We can use an ASCII table to convert that number to a letter. There are lots of ways to do this, but ASCII is one. That gives us a letter. ASCII table looks something like this. So someone was checking boxes to form numbers that formed letters that spelled out a URL. And the URL was catgirls.win/OMCB. Catgirls.win. Obviously, I clicked the link. And the link goes to a Discord. And the Discord is called Checking Boxes. So I joined the Discord. And someone is really excited to see me. So we chat for a minute, and then she asks me a question that blows my mind, which is, have you seen your checkboxes as a 1,000 by 1,000 image yet? And I said no, and she showed me, and it looked like this. So if it's not clear, they are downloading all of the state, and then they're producing an image. They wrote code to do this. They're downloading the state, black checkboxes, or black pixels, or checked boxes, white pixels, or unchecked, or something like that. I don't remember. But anyway, we got a lot going on here, right? We got be gay, do crime, love that. But we've also got the binary message that I found. That's that repeating pattern down there. We've got a base64 version, which is what I use for transport, right above that. And a QR code with full error correction, by the way, also linking to the Discord. The Discord was full of very sharp teens, and they were writing this message in secret to gather other very sharp teens, and it totally worked. There were 15 people when I joined, and over 60 by the time that I left. I tried to make it hard for them to draw, but they said 1,000 times 1,000 is a million. They found a way, and they started drawing crazy shit. They put a Windows blue screen of death on the site. Someone was really, really into Jake Gyllenhaal and put a lot of sexy Jake Gyllenhaal gifs on the site. And near the end, as a treat, I removed all my rate limits for like 2 hours, and they put a real-time Rickroll on the site. There is so much more. All of the data is public, so you can go extract this for yourself. I found this, in addition to very cool, so moving. I spent my childhood doing stupid stuff on the computer, and people mostly did not get mad at me when I, for example, repeatedly crashed my high school mail server. And so getting to provide a playground like this, getting to respond with praise and encouragement and telling them how cool I thought this was meant so much to me. They are so talented and so creative and so cool, and I cannot wait to see what they go on to make. Oh, I get a little emotional every time I talk about that. So what did we learn? What's the message of this talk? Sites like this need constraints. We need to rein in the 4% of people that are trying to ruin it for everybody. But the joy, the best stories, come from how people subvert them. That's my talk. So you can ask a question if you want, but if you don't want to, that's okay too. Yes?
Is there something in particular that just allows you to keep this ridiculously playful and clever spirit? I've followed your stuff for like the last reasonable amount of time that led up to this, and I've found that you have led me to getting into way more fun of just like making stuff to make stuff and computing for the enjoyment of it. And I wonder if there's something that's like particularly what you build from that allows you to express wonderful things like this and also build like what you're making that we all just saw here that's so cool.
Well, thank you. Sorry, the question was approximately like what makes you do the things that you do. Or sorry, I'm repeating it for the Zoom. That's very kind. I think there are a few things. I think that there is stuff that I like doing because I can't help myself. In particular, embedding games and things is something that I've just always liked doing. That is just kind of a fundamental fact about me. I really like stupid hacks. I was always trying to bring stupid hacks into my work back when I was a software engineer, and I kind of get to do that for fun now. One thing that I think is just straightforwardly true and worth mentioning is that, like, for the time being, this is all I do. I like saved up money to be able to do this, and so I like get to play around with computers all day, and that's really cool, and I'm very lucky in that way. But I do think it's like worth calling that out, that I like spend a lot of time thinking about it. When it comes to stuff like this, stuff like 1 million checkboxes or any of the other Stranger Things, there I think I really like kind of bringing people together. I like throwing parties, and I think that is something similar. What I find is that I very consistently have ideas for stupid things that could get people to play together. And kind of what holds me back there, or kind of the thing that I'm normally thinking about, is this constraint thing. That's what really helps me. When I come up with a constraint that I'm excited about, that's what tells me that, like, okay, like this is worth pursuing. One other thing I can do, not to plug Recurse Center too hard, is say that I was making pretty normal games before I did my first batch at Recurse Center. I was making like games with like high scores. And I came here, and on the first day we had a pairing exercise to like implement the back end to a game, and I convinced someone to do it in SQL. And people thought that was fun, and that kind of pushed me to start getting weirder. And I found that as I got weirder, people liked my work more, and I liked my work more. And I do think that there's something to building stuff around a lot of other people and getting kind of more regular feedback, because no one was seeing my work before then. So I think that helped a lot as well. Yeah, that's a good question. So the question is like how did I approach like build anxiety or figuring out how to do something that you don't know how to do.
That anxiety of just like giving up.
Yeah. I think one thing that helped was just like doing this for a living for many, many years, right? Like I think.
Too, so.
What was that?
I do it too. It's just putting something out like this is just so intimidating.
Oh, sure. I think like specifically for building for the public, I think it was a much more incremental thing, right? Like I released my first game almost exactly 2 years ago, and I think like 200 people played it on itch.io. Which is, itch is great. If you're looking to build like kind of platformer games or something like that, you can put it on there and like some people are going to play it. And that was really exciting, right? Like I think that once I got over the hump of just like deciding to ship it, having anyone interact with anything that I had made in a public way meant a lot. And once I kind of felt that, I wanted to keep going. I think a thing that I did early on that really helped was committing to shipping everything that I started. And that was not that every idea I had was good, so much as that you learn so much out of shipping things and seeing people interact with them and sometimes failing. Like a thing that I got a lot out of at Recurse was shipping this game that kind of sucked, and realizing like while playtesting it that it kind of sucked and I didn't like it, but I like shipped it anyway. And that in the long run gave me a lot of insight into what I didn't like doing, and that was really valuable, even if it felt really, really bad in the short term. But I think the thing that helped the most was making tons and tons of small things and simply committing to like, I will put this out there. And I know that's like maybe not the most helpful answer if you're like, I'm anxious about this, and I'm like, just fucking do it. Like that doesn't like, but I do think that very small things that you aren't super committed to, that like I worked on this for a week, if nobody likes it, it doesn't really matter, and consistently doing that for a while is a big part of what helped me. Sorry, that was a long answer. That's a great question. The question, I guess I should still repeat it, I don't know, is like, do I have thoughts on how to apply this constraint-based philosophy to games that have a larger scope? Not really. So in other versions of this talk that were more focused on Stranger Video, I talk about how I think that a key to the interactions that I like to kind of create is that they are short and hyper-focused, that they use only one medium. They're typically either checkbox or video or audio and nothing else. And they are an experience that you can get something out of in 30 seconds or less. I think it's much harder to apply this to something that you're meant to interact with for like 5 or 10 minutes for a session. Because, yeah, I don't know, your constraints have to be a lot more involved. And it feels a lot worse if you get constrained. If you join Stranger Video and you get kicked off, you really don't care because it took you 10 seconds. But if you wrote up a big text post and it gets blocked, I think you feel kind of shitty. That said, it's an interesting question, and I think worth pursuing. It just, you might want to, I don't know, break the problem down in some way. And I wish I had a better answer. If I did, I would have tried to build something like that. I read about that last year, but it's definitely not something that I don't know, like I interacted with when it existed. So kind of not really. There are definitely things that I think about a lot. I think about Twitch Plays Pokemon probably more than any other game, which is not like old internet, but is like that's a decade ago or something. A little more than that, I think. I think Reddit ran a couple of very compelling social experiments in the last 10 years. Place, which a lot of people have compared 1 million checkboxes to, and the button, I think are really, really interesting. Those are certainly things that I think about. There are a lot of things out there, but it's not normally something that I'm like trying to directly channel in the process of making something. Although with shutting down 1 million checkboxes, I did look into how Place shut down and kind of tried to do something that was relatively consistent with that, because I think what they did was really elegant. That's an interesting question. So do I consider this to be games or art or something else? I think about this a lot. I think actually a fun example that kind of taught me about this, although it's going to seem silly right now, is this game, the calendar game where you run Brick Breaker inside Google Calendar. This is the first time I thought about this, and this is going to sound really silly. But my point here is that I made this game, and you run Brick Breaker inside your Google Calendar, and it declines your meetings for you, and it's great. And I made it, and I posted about it on the internet. And it's a Chrome extension that you can install. And about 1,000 people have installed the extension, but I don't know, 1 million something people have seen a video of it. And a thing I learned from that and some of these other projects is that like the output of that was a video. It wasn't a game. Like 1,000 times more people have watched this than have played it. For this Flappy Bird project, similarly, the output of that was a blog post explaining how I did this. Nobody is playing this stupid game, but people are interested in learning how I did it. So I think about that a lot with projects like this. And in fact, with these, I've kind of concluded that I love doing this, but I wouldn't be happy to only do this, that this is kind of a party trick. Just a really fun party trick that I like a lot. I think like Stranger Video feels pretty artsy to me, and in fact, I explicitly chose to not add things that would have, I never use the words win or lose on the site, for example. There's no leaderboard, there's no scores, and that was very, very intentional. I figured that would kind of encourage people to cheat, which I wasn't prepared for, instead of just treating it as an experience. I don't really know for something like 1 million checkboxes. It's, I think a fun thing is to create something like this and just kind of put it out there and see how people interact with it, and people bring their own meaning, right? A lot of articles about it were like, the goal of the site is to check all the boxes. It's like, that's not, I didn't say it, you said that. And I don't know, I kind of make the things that seem compelling to me, and I don't worry too much, with the exception of stuff like this, which that was a big lesson for me. Sorry, I'm gonna get that off the screen. Let's go back. Oh, sorry, yeah, I really can't see, so if you just like shout at me, that also works. Someone in the back, I truly cannot see you. Yeah.
I'm sorry if you answered this question during the talk, but how much did you end up spending for 1 million checkboxes?
Oh, sorry, I totally should have answered that, and I didn't. I think I spent about $800, and it was covered by donations. Actually, I should say, I didn't spend down much infrastructure after the Go rewrite, and I could have severely reduced my costs. That was because I wanted to keep everything up to be able to write good blog posts about all of the stuff. And I didn't want to like accidentally lose some work. So those costs could have been, I don't know, closer to like maybe $500 if I had been just a little better about doing that.
How did it deal with all the TCP connections?
So, I mean, to the degree that I had a load balancer, it's just like Nginx, right? But yes, kind of. I think I increased the number of open files that you could have on the boxes and a few other things like that. Like I did a lot of ulimit stuff, but it was just kind of like put in big numbers and don't worry about it. That was most of it. I thought at some point, so early on, my Nginx config was pretty naive. And at the point at which I started needing to bounce my servers regularly, right? I was running into problems where a client would get pegged to a server, and that server was down. And you wanted to kind of like peg a client to a specific server so that like all of their updates went to the same place. And so I changed my Nginx config to like remember, oh, this box has been down recently, don't send clients there for a while, which I guess is kind of load balancery. But those were I think the two big things. What constraints am I looking to play with next? I don't know how people will feel about this, but I've been thinking a lot about like money adjacent projects in fun ways. Not like in big ways, but I've been thinking about kind of like CTF adjacent projects, capture the flag adjacent projects with like money prizes that are interesting to get access to. So there are kind of things like that I've been thinking about a lot. Been thinking about a game that you can choose to win at any time, which I think is kind of interesting, which is based on this game called Finchley Central that was popular with British mathematicians in the 80s. Also Breath of the Wild. But also kind of, I think a lot more often I have an idea for an interaction that I want to allow, but I don't know how to constrain it in a way that feels good. Like I think that is, that's often a place that I spend time in. I don't have a good example for you off the top of my head. Sadly, I'd have to go look at my ideas list because I've kind of retired those ideas for now. But I think in my experience, there are lots and lots and lots of ways that it's fun to interact with a stranger if the stranger's not being a jerk. And the hard part is how to make sure that most of the time they aren't being a jerk. So I'm looking for constraints more than interactions, if that makes sense. Yeah, so how did I know when it was time to end? So a few days in, I was like pretty stressed about running it. It was really fun, but I was also like, if this level activity remains forever, I can't man it. Like, this is too much. This is something that I can do for a bit, but it's not something that I can do forever. And I actually reached out to the designer behind Place, who was kind enough to respond. And the question I asked him was like, hey, how long do you think people are going to care about this? Like, if it's going to be forever, I can't do that. What was your experience with Place? And the advice he gave was like, most people will stop soon. Don't worry too much about it. But also, some people are going to care forever, and you're going to have to kick them off. And I think that's relatively consistent with what kind of Reddit's done at a few different points. And so I kind of had that in my head, and that wasn't like a hard, okay, like I'm going to stop at this exact point. But I got comfortable with about 2 weeks. That felt like a nice amount of time. And it being exactly 2 weeks was mostly that I had to like write the code to sunset it and test it. And I also wanted to give the kids in the Discord like a heads up that I was going to shut down the site and let them like play around. But I don't know, vibes. I did have some like traffic numbers. It was clear to me that people were less interested in that, which again was like expected and good and fine. And I think if anything, I shut down a little too late. If I could do it again, I would have shut down a few days sooner. I think it's better, at least in my mind, or the way that I feel, to get to say, all right, like this thing is over and we had a really good time and we can enjoy that it happened versus like trying to cram 2 more people in or something like that. I'd rather the experience be a little more special for the people that did get to participate. Yeah, so like how do you decide what not to build? This is a great question. One thing that comes up a lot when I talk to other people that do similar things is that you really don't know what's going to be a hit. I explained 1 million checkboxes to people at ITP as I was building it, and people like kind of chuckled, and that was it. No one was like, yeah, this is going to make the New York Times. And I explained it to some friends that think about similar things, and some of them were kind of interested in like the constraint elements, but I don't think anyone had any sense that it was going to be particularly popular. And at the same time, they say this repeatedly, that you really don't know. So I think a lot of it is like gut. It is, I am excited about this, or I am not excited about this. I think it depends a lot on the work. When I am trying to like embed a game in a surprising place, I normally show my work to other people, and I can tell from their reaction whether it's like good or interesting or funny or not. I think that's kind of more accessible, and it's like, here's a joke, like, is it funny? And you laugh or you don't laugh, and then like that is valuable feedback. I think with these more complicated systems, it's a little harder because a lot of like what's interesting is like these emergent properties that only happen when you have a lot of people on the site and you can't imagine, someone that you're telling this to can't imagine what that's going to look like. So I guess the thing I kind of try to do is just like make a lot of things that like I've kind of regretted the times that I've spent a lot of time on something, and I think a lot of the things that I've made that either have been the most popular, or that's not the only metric, but also like that I have found the most interesting are things that I've made relatively quickly. That said, I do bail on projects these days more than I used to. I don't hold myself to always shipping, and that's just kind of, I'll get in and I'll have kind of enough of a thing that I can picture the finish line and picture how I feel about it. And if I get there and I'm just not excited about it, I drop it, and that's totally fine. Okay, so TC is, as far as I know, like approximately always on. I don't want to say like, oh yeah, it's always there on any distribution no matter what, but it's been there whenever I've looked for it. You need to be root. You tell the kernel to do some stuff with. Now I can't tell you about all of the underlying implementation details. I do know that at some point when I was at AWS, we like crashed a decent part of the fleet by screwing up a rule. So like that is possible, although we're doing something very weird that you would not do with normal TC stuff. Yeah, I don't know. It's always there. You run as root. The rules are this kind of weird combination of like filters that kind of make sense, where you're reasoning about like this traffic is this source port or this destination IP, and then these things called classes and queuing disciplines that I truly cannot explain to you the difference between at this point. But approximately, you build up a big graph, and your filters are the edges in the graph, and you kind of say this packet is going to go through this entire graph no matter what. Filters kind of tell you which node to go to next, and then the nodes can have limits on like at this node, I don't know, drop every bit of traffic over 500 megabits a second, and then the next rule could do something else as well. And that's a bad explanation. I'm sorry, but.
No, that's super helpful. Thanks for helping me not also owe $10,000.
Yeah. It is very good for this very simple thing, and you can do that. Like, you can figure out how to do that by looking on the internet without needing to know how TC works broadly. How and where do I draw inspiration from, and what is my creative process? Let's see. This is a hard question for me, or like I don't have like a good, simple, concrete answer. I use the computer a lot, and so one thing I do is that I like to put games in weird places, and I'm always looking there for like, well, a game really just kind of needs some basic input and output, and when I noticed like, I can do something here. I can like click this button and this thing responds in this compelling way. I kind of make note of that. In terms of kind of more social experimenty stuff, there I think I get a lot out of talking to other people that do kind of similar things, and about reading about the history of different games, like the thing that I'm thinking about right now, the game that I'm thinking about next. I found by going to the Wikipedia page for like the game, like I just lost the game, and being like, what is the history of this? How did people arrive at this game? And then reading about the kind of precursors there, because I think they're pretty interesting. I play a lot of games, and I try to consume a lot of media that other people that are doing kind of similar stuff put out, and I think that helps a lot in the background. And I spend a lot of time in places like this, or just kind of meeting up with friends to pitch ideas. I think this is really hard to do in isolation. And then I have a big list of ideas, and unfortunately, I think that list of ideas is approximately right only. That is, I have an idea, and it's either exciting enough that I do it immediately, or I will probably never do it. With a few exceptions, there are things that like, there's something that I want to do that requires good weather. So like, we're waiting for that. But outside of that, I think that I can normally just kind of like, a picture forms in my mind that I'm excited about, and then I will pursue that thing. Or it's not, but I'm kind of sad that I'm not going to do it, and so I write it on my list to feel a little bit better about myself. I'm sorry, I wish I had like a, here's my creative process answer, but yeah. All right, I think that's the time that we've got.